Bon dia a tothom. Des de Biblioteques de Barcelona us donem la benvinguda a la presentació del nou llibre de Rachel Cusk, Desfile, de Libros del Asteroide, Desfilada, de l'editorial Les Hores. Donem les gràcies a l'autora Rachel Cusk, que ja ens va visitar fa 3 anys a l'Agustí Centelles, a l'escriptor i periodista Antonio Lozano, a Luis Solano, a Aurora Núria Cots, de Libros del Asteroide, i a Maria i Manel, de Les Hores. Com sempre, hi ha venda de llibres al vestíbul i en acabar l'acte, pujant a l'escenari per aquesta banda d'aquí, hi haurà signatura de llibres. Gràcies.
Bueno, buena tarde, buenas tardes. Bueno, antes que nada agradecer a Libros del Asteroide y Las Horas que han vuelto a confiar en mí para conversar con Rachel Cusk, porque ya nos vimos en 2021, o sea, ya han pasado 4 años, cuando presentó su libro anterior, Segunda Casa, La Otra Casa. Y bueno, siempre es un desafío para un periodista y al mismo tiempo un gran placer. Y ya digo, estoy hiper agradecido de estar aquí, porque Rachel Cusk es una autora tremendamente estimulante, yo creo que de las más estimulantes de la narrativa actual, de la anglosajona seguro, porque su narrativa siempre está muy ligada al pensamiento, ¿no? Y a las ganas de interpelarnos, ¿no? Formula preguntas, denuncia, sacude, se revela, desmonta, cuestiona, va detrás de verdades profundas, aspira a abrir espacios nuevos, pelea, reclama libertad, te zarandea, todo lo cual, ¿no?, sumado, genera una voz única que al final es el signo distintivo del artista, ¿no? Y siendo el arte un tema tan caro y tan troncal a su obra, a mí me acuerda esa expresión de André Breton, que dijo que el arte será convulso o no será, ¿no? Pues yo creo que las obras de Rachel Cusk nos convulsionan, ¿no?, formal y temáticamente. Y es el caso, por supuesto, de Desfile, Desfilada, que no es una excepción, ¿no? En sus páginas encontramos a un artista, G, que va mutando de identidad y que sirve a la autora para abordar temas de calado sobre creatividad, feminidad, género, maternidad, el cuerpo, la violencia, la libertad, el duelo. Pues un hervidero de ideas marcado por cierta voluntad de riesgo y por una aspiración a reenfocar, ya digo, a cuestionarnos, a lanzar preguntas y a crear desde una honestidad muy infrecuente. Y bueno, después de esta breve introducción, empezamos ya con la charla. So, Rachel?
Oh, they've been signaling to me.
Well,
I should have been
nothing,
listening to that. I was letting waves of beautiful Spanish roll over me. In fact, I could have understood it all.
Nothing you've never heard before. So. But I don't know if the interpreter needs la intérprete necesita... ¿Sí?
Yes, I have to put these on if
Emma,
it's Spanish. But you're going to ask the questions in English.
In English, yeah. But I don't know if she... Necessita posar-se els cascos perquè l'Emma... I don't know if you need to put them so Emma, the interpreter, will listen to you better in order to... Yeah? Yeah?
I should put them on?
Yes.
Okay.
In order to, for the interpreter to hear you properly. Yeah.
Okay. But I already have something on my ear.
¿Ya está?
I thought I only needed... Sorry, everybody. I thought I only needed this if...
No? She doesn't need it. No les necessita, llavors. No. Okay. No problem. Shall we start? Yeah. So,
I'm sure you said nice things. Yeah.
Vale, problemas técnicos. So, Rachel, first of all, thank you very much for being here once again. It's such a pleasure. And as I've said before, it's been 4 years since you came to Barcelona to talk about Second Place, your previous novel, that dealt with some of the issues that now reappear in Parade, womanhood, art, freedom, truth. When you finished Second Place, did you feel you wanted to expand some of the ideas contained there in another book? And if that was the case, do your novels usually work that way? I mean, the previous one opening up new paths for the next as a dialogue of sorts?
In a way, I'd say the opposite is true, and that there's very little continuity between my books in terms of me actually making them. It might be that when I look at it afterwards, I see that there's connections. But Second Place really felt like, I suppose, a story of confinement and of trying to being confined in life and confined in culture, and trying to see where the integrity and nobility of that was. And Parade is very much a book about fragmentation and change and violence, and so to me it feels very different.
So you need to break from one novel to the other? You usually need some fresh air, something new?
Well, I guess I want... I mean, each time I approach writing a book, because I think that reality changes all the time. The structure of reality changes all the time. And for me, the great kind of fault of the novel is that it treats reality as a completely stable state, and the relationship between language and reality as a very stable thing. Whereas for me, it isn't like that. And the things that were true 4 years ago are not necessarily true now. And that is especially the case with the relationship between language and living, which, frankly, if you look at the political sphere, you see the evidence of that, a total shift in that relationship between language and truth, which makes people very disturbed and anxious. And I think perhaps I'm always disturbed and anxious, because it doesn't surprise me at all. But that's very much, feeling that. And I mean, this is why, to me, writing is so interesting. This feeling that what was true and right 4 years ago is not, has not remained the same.
And it is fair to say that Parade is a challenging book. I mean, that you want the reader to think and to reflect. Nowadays, it seems that the opposite is the norm. The tendency is to simplify content, with some exceptions, obviously, but to make it more accessible, to entertain above all. Was Parade, as your previous work, written in a way as a sort of reaction to all this?
So I tend not to agree that things have got worse, or that I think maybe publishing is a bigger industry, that maybe there are more books being sold. I mean, one of the very useful things to read in life, if you're a writer, is Virginia Woolf's diaries, because she was, partly because they ran their own printing press and published their own. She was absolutely obsessed with her sales figures. And at one point she writes in her diary that to the Lighthouse, she had sold 2,000 copies, which was the most, for her that was the most enormous figure. It was the most she had ever sold of any book. And I think, whenever I read that, I think, well, probably those 2,000 people are still the same. And what publishing's trying to do is get all sorts of other people interested in reading and buying books. But To the Lighthouse is a pretty difficult book, and maybe there's only ever 2,000 people who are going to read it. So I think... I wouldn't say the novel has become more superficial, or I think probably the values are the same as
maybe not the novel, but the culture. The focus is more put on entertainment, and also this our ability to concentrate has gone with their social media. All that has gone down. So maybe...
Well, maybe some people's has, but as I say, it's probably completely different. We're talking about, vast numbers of people, and probably, as I say, only a minority of people have ever been interested in doing difficult things and concentrating, and everybody else just wants to have a good time. And, that's absolutely fine. So I feel... I do think one thing has changed in my quite long now experience of writing and doing things like this, and I'm absolutely sure that young people are reading much more and much more interested in the book as a physical object, and much more interested in ideas, and wanting things to be difficult, and wanting a different set of challenges. So my experience is very much not that the values of entertainment have contaminated what I do. They may have contaminated some other things, but I feel I have a much younger, bigger audience than I've ever had, and that is a very distinct shift of the last few years.
And I wonder if you agree with those who see you as a sort of experimental writer, or you don't like at all this label, yeah? And rather see yourself, you're just playing, to put it some way, playing with form and with narrative, or questioning literary conventions as your natural path in order to get to the places you want to go.
Was that a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Do I see myself as an experimental writer?
Or you don't like this label as experimental, or you see your work as just playing with form and playing with narrative?
No, I don't have any concept of particularly myself as doing anything. But sometimes, I do know that in the past, at times, I've done things that have made people violently angry and extremely critical. And usually that is for writing about, I guess, institutional identity at the level of institution, and particularly femininity at the level of institution, particularly motherhood and marriage. And I write things not with no idea of what anyone will think of them, but this anger, violent anger that sometimes my work arouses, it would be impossible not to ask why that is, and what it is that I've done that has aroused that violent reaction.
You haven't figured it out?
Huh?
Haven't you figured it out? Why?
Well, all I know is that quite soon afterwards, people stop being angry. And they sort of then say, "Oh yeah, that's right." So I think maybe it's just that either I'm the first person to say things, or that time. And I mean, one sees this so much in the history of culture, and particularly in the history of visual art, which is very much what Parade is. Parade is much more about visual art than about literary art. But the power of shock that the visual artist has, the Andy Warhol, who, and everyone thinks the world is coming to an end, and then very quickly that becomes the new reality. So I think perhaps there is something of that in it.
And going deeper into art, art again plays a key role in Parade. Is painting, sculpture, or any other visual art disciplines capable of doing things that literature can't, or is more limited? And would this be one of the reasons you keep coming back to them, to try to bring to your work some of their prerogatives?
I mean, yes, is the short answer. I think in my work always so far, the kind of problem of narrative, the problem that I have with narrative, the problem narrative has, according to me, has been a big subject of my work. And I'm not the only person to have that problem or to question the values of narrative and to see something almost a kind of monster that that is feeding on us, and that we then feed with our own, by the way that we live our lives. And I'm very much not a person who wants to catastrophize or say that things are terrible, that they've got worse. I just think this is a particularly interesting phenomenon, how literature has essentially resisted the radical It will not be radical. It refuses to be radical. And if it is radical, nobody follows. I mean, in visual art, if Picasso paints a cubist painting, suddenly everyone in the whole world is painting cubist paintings, and he's breaking down a gap in the wall, and everyone rushes in after him, and things evolve. In literature, that's not true. Even like 100 years ago, James Joyce writes Ulysses, and everyone is very shocked by that, but nobody follows. Everyone just goes back to writing the same, essentially Victorian stories. And it seems to me that has been something worth questioning. And essentially the way that visual art works is so it's the opposite. Essentially, it presents itself as, especially in the modern era, as incomprehensible. And once artists discovered abstraction, totally incomprehensible. And if you were asked your opinion, looking at a Jackson Pollock of what you thought this painting was about, you kind of hope that no one's going to ask you that question, because what would you say? And so this, it's really that idea of silence, of something that people would struggle to make language around, that interests me the most about it, and that makes writing about it so, I don't know, I want to say fun, but or challenging, I guess, is but interesting, basically.
And I've read you say that language, the problem with language is that it dates very quickly, no? Language, no? It gets it gets old very quickly.
Yes,
language.
Yeah.
That's a problem that other arts don't face, yeah?
Well, I mean, in terms of what language reveals about the person using language, it dates you. So, you show your age in language very easily and very, very quickly. And again, that's the feeling that as one grows older and continues to practice an art, the hope is that you'll get closer to the top of the mountain and closer to your goal, and the idea that actually this medium language might stop you from doing that. I think that's probably pretty true.
Going now into Parade, your novel deals extensively with how the male vision of things permeates everything, no? And how women behave and act and think according to it. How do you personally fight against this to find your voice and your freedom? How have you been fighting all your career?
I wouldn't say Parade that is quite what it does, because really it's asking a big question of creativity, which is what is a true woman creator, and in the visual arts, that's a pretty savage question. I think it's a lot harder to be a visual artist as a woman than to be a writer. It costs more money. It's more dangerous. It requires a different kind of presence in the world. And so for me, that question, and also because in the world of visual artists, the privilege of masculinity and the freedom of masculinity is essentially a sort of unassailable moral problem. That somehow this creative figure, no rules apply to him, and almost you feel that society wants visual artists to be and do everything that normal people can't be and do, and to exercise, as I say, this unrepentant freedom. And like part of how that works, I think, is, you know, in a language medium, it's really obvious. You know, in a novel, it would be hard for a writer to hide because their language reveals so much about themselves. But an image doesn't say anything particularly unless you interrogate it in a particular way. It doesn't necessarily say anything about the person who created it. So that question of the female creator, it seemed to me that in visual art, you know, it was put, that question was put much more aggressively, and it would be much more interesting to ask, like, how, you know, how would a woman artist evolve who was not just a woman existing on male freedoms, you know, essentially a woman saying, I'm not going to live as a woman because that sucks, frankly. I know that domesticity, children, marriage will stop me being an artist, so I'll essentially live a male life, but I'm a woman. And the book really is about how women who have to live as women could become, did become creators. Starting from, as you say, the first artist in the book who completely is the canonical figure of the male artist.
And talking about G, you know, probably the first thing that surprises the readers of Parade is the fluent identity, you know, of G, an artist that changes of genre, of skills. I guess maybe, I don't know if you agree with that, is less a character than maybe a construct or a vessel in order to reflect on many things. You know? And at the same time, you write about invisible authorship as a goal at one point, and about how art has more to do with history and shared experiences than with individuals. Can you walk us a bit through what G meant for you?
So there's numerous artists in the book, some of whom, if you know about art and are interested in art, are recognizable. Some of whom probably less so because they're more obscure figures. And I decided that all of these, I mean, my idea initially was that basically the biographies of artists, of visual artists, were a bit like the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, kind of filled with treasure that that nobody dares to break open, you know, because there did seem to be, or you know, has been almost a prohibition against making biographical interpretations of visual art. And you know, when there's an exception like Van Gogh, that everyone knows Van Gogh was mad and that he cut off his ear and he posted it, and that makes his art really, really interesting to people. And yet normally that interpretation is strongly discouraged. And so I think my idea was that these lives that cannot, that are almost hidden by the works that they produced, made a very different biographical shape, in which possibly the less understood or less considered or less available parts of ourselves could be illuminated. And you know, if you look at abstract art, and you think, in what way am I abstract? In what way could I be abstract? How can I be abstract? That's my question. Were these people abstract? Like, how did this work? You know, that there's an opportunity there to look at life very, very differently, not chronologically, not narrationally, not with a beginning, middle, and end, not to do with plots or events, but to do with these very powerful exchanges between, you know, the real and the unknown that I think are actually a massive part of everybody's experience of existence. That on the one hand, a novel will make banal, and a work by Rothko will elevate into something that you just stand silently in front of and don't even begin to think that you could explain it or understand it. Or so that seemed a link worth making to me.
And maybe I'm completely wrong here, but let me ask you. Related to this, subjectivity is seen at the moment in the novel as a sort of burden, like you're mutating artist, as an obstacle in trying to reach some truth. Will you extend this idea to your own work? I mean, do you try to remove your preconceptions to try to see and represent the world around you like more truthfully? I think that seems quite challenging for we can escape from ourselves now in a way.
I mean, yes, because again, you know, the problem with a novel is that it's a thing you write on your own, and you know that someone will read it on their own, and so actually the possibility that will never be checked by any kind of real process of verification is kind of frightening. And I mean, I've said before that you know, the links between literature and pornography are pretty strong. Something that comes out of my head goes into your head, and we both enact it in our heads. And you know, what is real about that? So I think and I mean, you know, you can call it subjectivity, essentially believing yourself too much and not testing what you're doing against other things that exist in the world, including the general population's lack of interest in reading novels, which is you know, that's a good thing to think about. But yeah, I mean, it is something I think about a lot.
And identity is not only complex for G. For many of your characters, feel at some point dissociated from themselves, or that this is why, for instance, the idea of the double keeps coming up, right?
Sorry, the
idea of the double, the doppelganger,
yeah.
Doppelganger, yeah.
Well, it's not so much a doppelganger as so in Parade, the very first part of it, as well as talking about this artist who solves his problems with abstraction by painting upside down. And that's not painting a picture and turning it upside down. It's actually deciding to paint the world upside down, so that it's real and not real at the same time. The sort of corresponding story is that section is called The Stuntman, is about female violence, essentially violence committed by women and violence committed against women, and how this notion that perhaps a woman has a stuntman, that she has someone who is divided from her, separate from her consciousness and her psychological being, who enacts the dangerous bits, the dangerous physical requirements of female biological existence. So it's kind of a double in a way, but I think it's, you know, is the stuntman the double of the actor? No, the stuntman is the person who takes the risks that the actor can't take, because the actor is, you know, an artist and has to take care of themselves.
Going back to this character who decides to paint things upside down, when a woman writer appears wanting to write also upside down, it is too far-fetched to think that she in some way represents your own struggle, or to invert many of the conventions that define most novels.
My struggles. Well, I mean, it's true that Well, I mean, two things went into two things in terms of my process went into the construction of this novel, and one was leaving England and therefore leaving English and moving to Paris and therefore moving into French, and that loss of language, well, not loss of language, but loss of a secure basis in language was an extremely risky and intense thing to do to myself. And almost, I think I wanted English to be taken away from me, to see who I really was without it. Anyone who's learned a language has had the experience of, in my case, being a 54-year-old woman demoted to being a 3-year-old child, making mistakes, being stupid, embarrassing herself. So that almost humiliation at the language level was very interesting to me. And the other part that went into, in terms of my own process that went into the book was, thinking so much about the processes of making visual art that are so different from the processes of writing, and allowing myself to be taught by that thinking so that I could actually make language behave differently, make it do something different that seemed to me to be much closer to that process of constructing a visual image. And that was a really interesting part of writing the book, and made it very difficult to write.
You have acquired a good level of French by now? I'm just curious.
You hope. It's okay. But the one thing that I can do at this point quite well is read in French. And so I've essentially spent a lot of time over the last 4 years in this kind of state that's a bit like when you take the little wheels off the child's bicycle, and I'm sort of, oh wow, I'm in a French novel with no support, and I'm going to keep going and get all the way to the end. And now that's become a very, very habitual process, and it again has deeply changed the way that I write.
And do you see yourself in the future writing something in French?
Definitely not. No.
Not? I mean, okay.
I very much disapprove of people doing that, unless they have to. I mean, I have the example of Agatha Christophe, who's Le Grand Cahier is one of my the most important works, and she arrived in France as a refugee, and she writes in her introduction, I don't speak French very well, and I don't like it either. She was 26. I don't really like it, but it's what they speak here, and so that's what I'm going to write in. And that really is a statement about displacement, and there's lots of examples of that. Conrad is another example of someone essentially taking on the master language because they themselves are in a state of total dispossession, and they've come to this place and they have to, I don't have to do that. And I think if I did do that, it would feel somehow insulting to people who actually know how to write in French. So I don't think I would.
I had this question saved for last, but now that we are talking about Paris and all that, and France, and have you noticed, though, if living in Paris has affected your work, be that formally or otherwise? The fact of just living there in some way permeates your work? Something has changed from living in England too?
Yeah, probably not in the way that you would necessarily think. I mean, there's this feeling that there are places where you're allowed to be one thing or another. And, I'm sure in this moment that Texas, for example, is, or Florida is one of those places where you're allowed to be a great Trump-supporting, MAGA person. And, we're seeing a lot of that in our time, of how an expectation that we're all the same generates real problems, because people in the end are going to explode if they're not, if they don't feel that there's a room for them to be who they are, to say what they think, to whatever that's worth. Paris has operated in the opposite way, in that it's a place where you're allowed to come and be creative, and the cafes are full of people making one tiny coffee last for sort of 6 hours while they sit there and write their novel or read Proust, or that absolutely does happen, and France does recognize and support artists, and for some reason, maybe because I'm a contradictory person, that's made me much more self-doubting than I used to be. So I immediately think, okay, if you're allowed to do this, there must be something wrong with it. And, almost perhaps I'm searching for what to me feels like the actual difficulty of what I do. And almost I don't like it if it's made to seem something I'm entitled to do. But that's just me.
Okay. And going back to Parade, you put a lot of weight in analyzing the body. Several characters seem ashamed of it or removed from it. There's also violence on the body. Do you think we don't pay enough attention to our bodies? We're having the focus usually put on the mind. Interests you?
Oh, I think this is the great issue of our times. Absolutely. I mean, if you can see the second half of the 20th century as a very brain consciousness-led era, where I think certainly many writers or intellectuals viewed themselves as a brain, like dragging a body around after it. And I think in our time, there's been a sort of shift that it would take a lot more time than we have to sort of work out what that is. That might be something to do with artificial intelligence. That might be something just generally to do with the internet and its knowledge. Like, you don't need to know anything now. You just look it up, and that, I mean, certainly in my writing, I really see what I do as a big response to that, in that I don't want any information in my books. I'm perfectly sure that people reading, if they have a question, as I do when I have a question, will look it up on the internet. I don't need to put it in my book. But I also think that there's possibly something that came out of war, even if it was the First World War, which is a very long time ago, which was an understanding of trauma as being something that happened to the body almost more than the mind. And that's actually been very slow to develop, that idea. And then suddenly it's the Vietnam War, and suddenly, the whole understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder is, people are like, oh, okay. So, like, how is it that these huge cataclysmic experiences, war, take so long to convince us of their, or to bear their evidence? Anyway, one way or another, I feel that in our time, there is I suppose a greater interest in the body as a repository of experience, and possibly even as a rival consciousness. I sometimes think that maybe we're not going to think with our brains anymore. We don't need to, and we'll think with our bodies instead. I mean, something like that would be an interesting alternative. Anyway, a lot of Parade is very much about the relationship of creativity to the body, and again, the visual artist as someone in whom that connection seems to be more vital than for the writer. None of which is to degrade reading or writing, just to, for me, I guess, enlarge its possibilities and enlarge its scope of interest.
This next question maybe is a bit abstract and very broad and philosophical.
That's fine, we're being abstract, it's okay.
Or metaphysical, philosophical. But reality appears to be very unstable and tricky in Parade. Its limits and boundaries are not clear. It's impossible to represent it faithfully. The imagination gets in its way. What were you trying to say about the nature of reality, maybe at this precise moment?
Well, that's a big question. I think I'm trying to say something about what is neglected by any definition of reality, a non-narrative view of reality, where, I think the thing that I'm interested in Parade is, as I said earlier, areas of self and its interactions with reality that are almost coded in their sort of enigmatic function in the way that we live, and that are unreferenced or unnoticed. And again, the power of a visual image, and particularly, one absolutely sees this in abstraction, the power of that art to correspond with what has not been, what possibly cannot be expressed in our own experience, with no transaction of language occurring at all, is a kind of amazing thing to admit for a writer. What can I possibly read that not even sheds light on, but unless it's things that like Beckett that go so far into difficulty. Really the only responsive language to that situation, as with painting, is to make something very, very, very difficult that's very hard to understand, and then you're forced into an acknowledgement of the limits of your understanding, which then makes you think, well, maybe I don't understand myself, and maybe I've not been understood, and all of this is just, an illusion, but the problem with language is that that there has to be a contract with the person reading it. Unlike a picture, which can just be there and it doesn't matter if someone's looking at it or not, a book has got to be read, and so you're playing with something kind of difficult. If you want to make the book, the harder you make the book, the less someone is able to read it. And most writers, probably me included in some way, don't want to desert comprehensibility, that partly because the economics of the book don't allow you to do that.
And now a note of humor, to balance things. I found really funny.
I've never lost my sense of humor. I just want to say.
I found really funny the passage where Julia, the character of Julia, asks herself if artists could be people who show us proudly their own shit, no? Because they didn't receive the message as children that such a thing is disgusting. Yeah, yeah. I found it really funny. That's it.
Well, I mean, I think that's probably true, isn't it? I mean, like we all, when we're children, we all paint pictures, and then suddenly we stop painting pictures, and just like we stop being proud of the products of our own bodies. So I thought that was quite a good theory.
Yeah, funny. And in the Stuntman, you write about a woman living in an unnamed foreign city who is attacked by in the street by a deranged woman. I've read this incident actually happened to you. Yes, am I right?
Sorry, I didn't.
This incident really actually happened to you. The attack on the street with the woman. I guess it was very disturbing. No? That it gave you a lot to think about.
Well, I think it doesn't perhaps matter whether it happened to me or not. I think what's definitely true is that one can go a very, very long way in life without really acknowledging its violence and its possibilities for violence. And again, this is the stuntman who deals with the violence so that you don't have to think about it. I mean, our lives are much more violent than perhaps we believe them to be. And when actual violence happens, like being mugged or attacked in some way or hit, or it feels. I mean, I just felt that it was really worth examining actual violence and how it doesn't seem to connect to anything else, and it's always thought of as you're really unlucky, that it's really rare that that sort of thing happens, or whereas in fact it's just the surface manifestation of things that we contain, and yet kind of almost deny our knowledge of. So whether or not it's biographically true, I think it actually is true.
Okay, thanks. And in the last chapter or section, in The Spy, but not only in it, you write about facing the sickness and the death of a mother. Suddenly the narrator changes to the plural. Was this because you wanted to stress the shared experience, especially? And was this chapter or section particularly difficult to write?
Well, I don't know how many people here have read the book,
No.
but the last part of the book is a pretty scary description of a parent dying, in which the pronoun is we rather than I. And I mean, in terms of sort of where that came from in my thinking about literature, I think I felt that I suddenly had lost its value in our world and representations of our world for now. I don't know how long for, but it feels like that to me. That for such a long time I was a place of ultimate legitimacy, particularly if your message, if what you had to say came from a place outside of the cultural center. If you're a marginal person, saying I is, being able to say it is really, really important. Having that as a essentially verifiable truth. And suddenly it seemed to me that was not so true anymore, and that in what may be a for good or ill, a loss of belief in authority, maybe a loss of belief in reality, which is, I think, maybe something that people feel. The I can't verify in the same way that it did, because it's isolated in that context, and that this collective voice felt to me like something that could be born out of a collapse of authority. And I mean, just thinking about dictatorship, for instance, like how does a dictator, how does that person get their power? And what would the power of I be against? What's the power of individuality against a dictator? A collective, however, against that is a slightly different thing. So it seemed to me that maybe this was a new way, and I mean, again, not entirely new. Annie Ernaux uses "we" in Les Années, and in that book, it's to say individual identity is an illusion. We've actually all been constructed by capitalism, politics, national identity. We have all actually watched the same TV, bought the same products, been governed by the same people. So what's the point of saying I? What's the point of thinking you're separate from that? That's pretty powerful. And what I have done in Parade is sort of a slightly different, I suppose, using that at the level of most intimate experience, of saying in our most intimate experiences, are we actually the same? Do we share experience? Is it not, is the primacy of the self and its experiences at an end? And kind of feeling that it would be good if that were so. Because the self and its experiences is what perpetuates desire and greed and illusion, and that actually this rather different idea of having some shared self strikes me as a very good way of dealing with absolutely unadorned reality, and a cause of hope.
I have more questions, but maybe we can give the audience the chance to ask you a few. No sé si algú té cap pregunta per l'autora. Veig una mà. Sí, ara, now you need, if they ask in Spanish or Catalan. Hi ha una mà per allà, no? Algú aixecava la mà?
I feel I have so many things on my head now. I wish I spoke Spanish. It would be so much easier.
My question is in English. It's okay.
Okay, great.
I enjoyed the comment you made when you were talking about your experience moving to Paris and your experience learning French and how you kind of felt like you became a toddler again. I was just wondering if you think that in relearning a new language, you kind of like relearn yourself in a way, like you give way to new opportunities to self-discovery?
Definitely yes, but I think that my most shocking discovery was how much age is a factor in being able to acquire that other self. That a person learning a language at 20 really does expand into a new terrain, and when you're older, it's a much more. There's just not the space in your brain, I guess. I don't know, but it's much harder and much more like translating yourself rather than gaining another self. It feels like translating yourself. Yeah.
Thank you.
¿Más preguntas? ¿Más preguntas, alguien?
Yeah, thank you for the interesting conversation. In a lecture recently at university, we were looking at an interview where you said that you were kind of bored of creating characters in writing. And I was wondering, I haven't read Parade, but I read Second Place, and I feel like that novel is very, like, the characters are the foundation of the novel, no? Could you maybe comment on what you meant by that?
So second place was written by reusing a book that already existed, and which was quite a funny book that is out of print, that concerns a very, very extraordinary, written by, this extraordinary woman called Mabel Dodge Luhan, who lived in the early 20th century. And part of what appealed to me was the idea of this, frankly, if she'd been a man, she would have left many traces behind her. And instead, she's a forgotten figure. And anyway, in this book, she describes, this book is about D.H. Lawrence coming to stay with her in New Mexico, where she lived, and she persuaded D.H. Lawrence somehow to, and they had the most violent falling out. And so in fact, all of the people, the characters in that book are reenactments of her, of what she tells and what she talks about. And, that did, at the time, seem to me like a solution to this business of kind of making things up, which I essentially refuse to do anymore. And the reusing, I guess, of a text, the reusing of the people in the text, felt like a much more bloodless and innocent enterprise than. But it is true that book has, for the reasons that it's built within this pre-existing structure, it has the shape of narrative, like more than other stuff that I've done. But it is still a weird project. So,
thank you.
Maybe one more question, maybe. One more question. ¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Alguna pregunta más?
Only if there is one. Don't feel you
If
have
not,
to.
I'll do it. No?
Hi, it was very interesting. I haven't read the book yet. I think it's very different from other books that you've written, because there's more fiction maybe, no? Or this science fiction almost, it seems so. But I would like to know, we've been talking about doubles. Do you need to dissociate? Rachel Cusk needs to dissociate in order to write the other non-fiction books, let's say.
Well, now that's it's not to do with fiction or non-fiction, but it is a good question. And
Right.
I've become very aware, actually, as I get older, that I am two people. And that's the only way that I've been able to live life ordinarily, never thinking I'm a writer, I'm never. Just generally not being particularly sort of aware of myself, or and it's very definitely another self that that then goes and writes about it. And because I do sometimes think, how did I have the kind of nerve to, even like writing about my parents, who were very frightening people. I mean, early in my career, that's what I did, and it enraged them, and writing about motherhood in the way that I did, and all the time just sort of really not. It's almost like the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing, and so I think there really has been this divide in myself. I would not have been able to do my work if I hadn't had that. If I'd cared about what I was doing, basically, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So I had a stuntman too, but my stuntman wrote the books rather than.
One more, maybe? The last one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
So thank you for the visit. So you said that now you're going to continue writing like non-fiction. Did I understand correctly? You're going to be writing non-fiction or reality?
No, I just said, do you mean what I just said?
No. Like in the future,
Writing
non-fiction. I don't know if I understand
No, 'cause it
correctly,
might have
but what
been
you said
I
in
didn't
the
speak
other
clearly.
question, so you're going to be writing more like inform about like events, like non-imaginary events. Did I understood this correctly? Like in the future?
No. I don't think I've ever particularly used imaginary events anyway. And no, I'm going to stick with the novel. I'm absolutely committed to the novel. And especially now that I've read so many French novels and I've seen what they call a novel, which is frankly nothing to do with fiction at all. That I think, okay, I'm going to stay in this form and kind of do what I want in it. But I think increasingly, there's been a long period where a lot of definitions have been attached to, is it autofiction, fiction, non-fiction, autobiography, memoir, and I guess I would like to see a world in which that was not necessary, and that a novel, news from the world, could contain anything. The other advantage of that is it gives you a really great legal backstop. Because if you call something a novel, then apparently nobody can sue you, or not really. So that's another very good reason. But no, I definitely do not make that distinction, nor do I intend to walk away from trying to make, for me, what seems to me trying to make the novel more radical and more daring.
Thank you.
So, Rachel, once again, thank you very much for finding the time to be with us. It's been
great pleasure.
Such a pleasure listening to you. Well, thank you very much. Okay.